St. Mary's General Hospital was a beacon of medical excellence in an affluent suburban community. The pristine hallways and polished floors gave the impression that everything was orderly and perfect. But beneath this veneer of perfection, there was a tension that would soon be revealed by my presence. Angela Parker. Initially unaware, I was simply excited to start working at this prestigious hospital. However, I quickly learned that deep-seated prejudices and institutionalized discrimination awaited me. On my first day, the feeling of spaciousness at the hospital's entrance quickly gave way to a sense of unease as soon as I stepped inside. Everything was overly quiet and cautious, as if someone's arrival had disrupted the order. As I approached the nurse's station, I noticed a sudden silence that fell over the area. The way eyes darted away. Although this made me uncomfortable, I tried not to show it. Maintaining my confidence, I asked, "Excuse me, I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could you direct me to the head nurse's office?" A blonde, blue-eyed nurse smiled at me, but there was a coolness in her smile. "Down the hall, third door on the right," she replied. I thanked her and proceeded towards the office. As I walked down the hallway, I felt like the sound of my footsteps echoed like a storm. Just as I was about to reach the office, I saw a tall, distinguished-looking doctor with salt and pepper hair emerge from the room. Hoping to make a good first impression with this doctor, I said, "Good morning, doctor. I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. It's a pleasure to meet you." However, the doctor's look was cold and distant. "Dr. William Graves," he said. "The standards at St. Mary's are very high. I hope you can adapt to them." Without even giving me a chance to respond, he passed by me. This encounter extinguished my initial excitement and hope in an instant. Still, I didn't give up. I took a deep breath and knocked on the head nurse's door. While waiting after knocking, I remembered the words my mother always said to me. "Honey, you're going to have to work twice as hard as everyone else, but never let them see you sweat. You come from a long line of strong women, and that strength is in you too." My mother's words reminded me of the difficult days in nursing school. Sometimes I recalled the condescending looks from professors, the whispers of classmates questioning if I truly belonged when I aced exams. But I always worked patiently. Now, at St. Mary's, I would continue this fight. The head nurse opened the door. With a stern expression, she said, "Miss Parker, I presume. Come in. We have a lot to cover," she said. As I entered the head nurse's office, I felt I was not just starting a new job, but entering into a bigger fight. In this hospital, beneath the veneer of professional smiles and sterile order, a silent storm was brewing. My first day was filled with orientations, introductions, and endless paperwork. As I walked around the hospital, I felt a distance between me and others. Conversations would stop when I approached, and would start again in hushed tones once I passed. The conversations I tried to have with other nurses were met with polite but distant responses. I felt like a stranger in an environment where I should be collaborating. By the time my shift ended, I was physically and mentally exhausted. As I took my things from my locker, I overheard two nurses whispering. "Did you see the new hire?" one said. "Yeah, this isn't exactly the place for her," the other replied. My heart sank. I had hoped the coldness was temporary. But now I understood the seriousness of the situation. This wasn't just a job. It was a place where I'd have to fight prejudice every day. As I walked to the bus stop, my mind was filled with complex emotions. The excitement I had felt that morning had slowly been replaced with doubt and loneliness. At the bus stop, I took out my phone and called my mother. On the second ring, I heard her warm voice, "Baby girl, how was your first day?" Hearing my mother's voice, my eyes welled up. "It was tough, Mom," I could barely whisper. My mother's voice was full of understanding and strength. "Angela Marie Parker, listen to me carefully. You work too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember who you are and where you come from. You're not just there for yourself, but for every little black girl who dreams of walking those hallways one day." I closed my eyes and let my mother's words empower me. "I know, Mom, but I didn't expect it to be this hard," I said. Nothing worthwhile is ever easy, honey. But you have generations of strength behind you. Hold your head high, do your job better than anyone else, and never let them see you falter," she said. I told my mom, "Yes, Mom," and I felt a renewed hope. After I hung up the phone, I noticed a black Mercedes slow down beside me. Through the tinted windows, I saw Dr. Graves looking at me. Then the car sped away. I straightened my shoulders, my mother's words echoing in my ears. This was going to be a difficult battle, but I wasn't alone. With the strength from my family and my determination to prove myself, I would overcome all the obstacles that St. Mary's put in my way. As the bus approached, I was ready for a new day. I didn't know it then, but my presence at St. Mary's was about to trigger a series of events that would shake the hospital's culture to its foundations, revealing long-hidden prejudices. As weeks passed, my work environment at St. Mary's became more challenging. The coolness of the first few days evolved into a more insidious form of exclusion. It was hard to pinpoint but impossible to ignore. I felt treated differently from my white colleagues. Dr. Graves, in particular, seemed to take perverse pleasure in finding fault with my work, no matter how diligently I performed my duties. "Nurse Parker," he called out one morning, in a way that everyone could hear, "I hope you're familiar with our protocols. We can't afford any mistakes." The emphasis he put on the word mistakes sent a shiver down my spine. I looked him in the eye, determined not to show my fear. "Of course, Dr. Graves. I'm well versed in all hospital procedures," I replied. The doctor smiled sarcastically. "We'll see about that," he said. His mocking tone didn't go unnoticed by me or the other nurses around. As Dr. Graves walked away, I felt the weight of judgmental stares pressing down on me. Throughout the day, I was assigned the most challenging and undesirable tasks. My white colleagues handled simpler cases, while I had to deal with the most complex and difficult patients. "Angela, would you mind taking care of Mr. Johnson in room 305? He's been a bit challenging today," said a nurse with a sickly sweet tone. Mr. Johnson was known for his racist outbursts and had already made 2 nurses cry that week. But I saw this assignment as an opportunity. I was determined to prove myself, maintaining my professional stance. When I entered Mr. Johnson's room, I was ready for the expected racist attacks. "What are you doing here?" I said, "I don't want a colored nurse touching me," he said. I took a deep breath and tried to protect myself against the hateful words. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressing. I assure you, I'm qualified enough to take care of you," I said. While enduring constant racial slurs and insults, I remained calm and did my job carefully. As I left the room, I saw Dr. Graves waiting for me in the hallway. He had a fake look of concern on his face. "Is everything okay, Nurse Parker? We heard a commotion," he said. I looked him in the eye. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable and his dressing has been changed. Is there anything else you need from me?" I asked. The doctor had a flash of surprise, but then his cold look returned. "Well, let's hope you can maintain the same calm with your other patients. We wouldn't want any complaints," he said. This encounter felt like a test I had to pass. But why did I have to take such a test? Throughout my shift, I was constantly running around trying to get everything done. While my white colleagues chatted, laughed, and had it easy, I was rushing back and forth. This inequity was blatant. Whenever I thought of expressing my feelings about this, I remembered my mother's words, "Never let them see you falter." By the end of my shift, I was physically and emotionally exhausted. As I took my things from my locker, I overheard 2 nurses talking. "I can't believe they are making a big deal about diversity hires," one of them said, with a disdainful tone. "They will never be able to keep up with us," said the other. I stood still by my locker, feeling my heart pound. I wanted to confront them and defend myself, but I knew that would only strengthen their prejudices. So I quietly closed my locker and left the hospital, keeping my head up despite the weight on my shoulders. As I was walking to the bus stop, I saw the black Mercedes pull up beside me. The window opened and Dr. Graves was behind the wheel. "Nurse Parker, He called out with a fake concern. "Waiting for the bus again? It looks like that's all you can afford on a nurse's salary, right?" he said. Before I could respond, the car sped away. This cruel act had hurt me, reminding me of the difficult battle I faced every day at St. Mary's. On the bus, I was overwhelmed with emotions. The excitement and hope I had felt when I first started at St. Mary's seemed like a distant memory. I realized I was just trying to survive. But at that moment, I realized something had to change. Either I would break down under this pressure, or the hospital's culture would change. I didn't know it then, but an ally was about to enter my life, and would help me reveal the long-hidden prejudices and help shift the balance in my favor. As the bus went through the dark streets, I closed my eyes and drew strength from my mother's words. Tomorrow would be a new battle, and I was ready to face it no matter what. The next morning, I came to St. Mary's more determined. The night before, I had reflected on my experiences and reminded myself why I became a nurse, to help people no matter what. As I walked to the nurse's station, I noticed a bustle. Nurses were preparing a room, and there was a different kind of excitement in the air. "What's going on?" I asked. The nurse, forgetting her usual coldness, said, "We have an important patient coming in, a famous person who had a skiing accident and broke both of his arms." Before I could ask anything else, Dr. Graves appeared. With a stern expression, he said, "Nurse Parker, you will take care of the new patient in room 412, Mr. Thomas Edwards. He had a skiing accident, and both of his arms are broken. I expect you to provide him with the utmost care and attention." I nodded. "Of course, Dr. Graves." I knew that this assignment was just another test. As I walked to room 412, I had the feeling that this assignment was different. As I entered the room, I saw a middle-aged man in the bed with casts on both of his arms. Despite his injuries, there was a quiet authority about him. "Good morning, Mr. Edwards," I said with a warm smile. "I'm Nurse Angela Parker, and I'll be taking care of you." Mr. Edwards looked up at me with his sharp eyes. "Good morning, Nurse Parker. I appreciate your help. I didn't expect to end up here after my skiing accident," he said. While checking his vitals, I noticed that Mr. Edwards was watching my every move. Unlike the other patients, his gaze was not prejudiced or disdainful, only thoughtful and curious. "You seem very competent, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said. "How long have you been working at St. Mary's?" I was surprised by his genuine interest. "I've been here for a few weeks, sir. It's been quite an experience so far," I replied carefully. Mr. Edwards raised his eyebrows, his voice slightly amused. "I see. And how have you found the hospital? Does it live up to its prestigious reputation?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. Just then, Dr. Graves came into the room. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Graves exclaimed with a fake smile, "I trust Nurse Parker is taking good care of you. We only give our most important patients to our best staff." I did my best to keep a straight face, as I knew that Dr. Graves had never trusted me before. Mr. Edwards, on the other hand, noticed the inconsistency. "Yes, Dr. Graves," he replied, his eyes going back and forth between the doctor and me. "Nurse Parker has been exemplary. I was just asking her about her experiences here at St. Mary's." Dr. Graves' smile faltered, but then quickly he recovered. "Well, I'm sure she will tell you it's been excellent. We pride ourselves on our inclusive and supportive environment here at St. Mary's." I felt a surge of anger at Dr. Graves' blatant hypocrisy, but I maintained my professional demeanor. Mr. Edwards seemed to sense the underlying tension, however. "Is that so?" he mused, his eyes never leaving my face. "Well, I look forward to experiencing the supportive environment firsthand during my stay." While Dr. Graves went into a detailed explanation of Mr. Edwards' treatment plan, I felt like I had just witnessed something important. The way Mr. Edwards looked at me, his pointed questions, it was as if he could see beyond the surface of St. Mary's. In the following days, I found myself spending more time in Mr. Edwards' room than with any other patient. Despite his injuries, he was engaging, often asking me questions about my work and my background. Unlike most of the patients and staff, Mr. Edwards seemed genuinely interested in my answers and never showed a hint of prejudice. One afternoon, while changing his bandages, I overheard a conversation outside the room that chilled me to the bone. "I don't care what Dr. Graves says," said a nurse. "I don't trust that Parker woman with our VIP patient. Who knows what she might do?" Another voice agreed, "I know, but we can't say anything. They'll accuse us of being racist." My hands trembled as I finished my work. The constant suspicion and mistrust was getting to me. Mr. Edwards, ever observant, noticed my distress. "Is everything all right, Nurse Parker?" he asked gently. I forced a smile. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. I'm just concentrating on getting these bandages just right." Mr. Edwards was silent for a moment, looking at my face. "You know," he finally said, "I've always believed that a person's true character is revealed not in how they treat their superiors, but in how they treat those they perceive as beneath them." I looked up, startled by his comment. Mr. Edwards looked at me, his eyes knowing. "I've seen a lot in my time, Nurse Parker, and I can tell you, the view from this bed has been illuminating." Before I could respond, Dr. Graves entered the room, cutting our conversation short. As I left, I had the feeling that Mr. Edwards was more than just an important patient. His words and actions hinted at a deeper understanding of the dynamics at St. Mary's. And for the first time since I started working there, I felt a glimmer of hope. Little did I know that Mr. Edwards' presence was about to set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of St. Mary's, exposing the prejudices that had festered for a long time. As the days passed, I became increasingly isolated at St. Mary's. The initial coolness from my colleagues had evolved into outright hostility, with whispered comments and pointed glares following me everywhere. Dr. Graves, emboldened by the lack of consequences for his behavior, became more overt in his attempts to undermine me. One morning, as I was reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station, Dr. Graves approached me with a stack of files. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're particularly challenging. I trust you're up to the task." I looked at the pile and realized that it was nearly double the workload of my colleagues. I met Dr. Graves' gaze, determined to not show any sign of intimidation. "Of course, Dr. Graves, I'll see to it right away." As Dr. Graves walked away, I heard him mutter under his breath, "Let's see how she handles this." Throughout the day, I was running from one difficult case to another. The patients assigned to me were among the most demanding in the hospital. Despite the overwhelming workload, I refused to let my standards slip. I approached each patient with the same level of care and professionalism. However, the constant pressure was taking its toll, both physically and emotionally. While rushing to respond to another call light, I overheard two of my colleagues whispering nearby. "Can you believe they're letting her handle all these critical cases?" said one nurse. "It's like they're just waiting for her to mess up." "I know," the other replied, "but you have to admit, it's impressive how she keeps going. I would have cracked by now." I was filled with a mix of anger and hurt. The fact that my colleagues knew about the unfair treatment and were waiting for me to fail was almost unbearable. As the day went on, I started going to Mr. Edwards' room more often. Unlike the rest of the hospital, his room had become a refuge for me. "Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards greeted me, "you look exhausted. Is everything all right?" I managed a weak smile. "Just a busy day, Mr. Edwards. Nothing I can't handle." Mr. Edwards looked at my face. "You know," he said carefully, "there's a difference between handling something and thriving. From what I've seen, you're capable of the latter." His words highlighted the difference between how Mr. Edwards treated me and how the rest of the hospital staff did. I felt a lump form in my throat. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," I said barely above a whisper. "I appreciate your kindness." As I turned to leave, Mr. Edwards called out to me. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice filled with a quiet authority. "Remember, sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to speak up." I left the room, my mind whirling with the implications of Mr. Edwards' words. As I walked back to the nurse's station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Little did I know that the next day would bring a series of events that would push me to my limits and force a confrontation that had been brewing since my first day at St. Mary's. The next morning, I arrived at work to find the hospital in a state of heightened activity. Rumors were swirling about a high-stakes emergency operation scheduled for later that day, with several hospital board members and important visitors expected to observe. As I began my rounds, I couldn't help but notice the nervous energy permeating the hospital. Nurses and doctors alike seemed on edge, the pressure of the upcoming operation weighing heavily on everyone's minds. Midway through my morning duties, Dr. Graves approached me, a glint in his eye that immediately put me on guard. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "we need you to assist in the emergency operation this afternoon. It's a critical case. I trust you're prepared to handle it." I felt a mix of surprise and suspicion wash over me. Being asked to assist in such a high-profile operation was usually an honor, but coming from Dr. Graves, I couldn't help but wonder if there was an ulterior motive. "Of course, Dr. Graves," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I'll be ready." As Dr. Graves walked away, I overheard him muttering to another doctor, "Let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting." The hours leading up to the operation were a blur of preparation and anticipation. I threw myself into my work, double and triple checking everything to ensure I was as prepared as possible for whatever challenges the operation might bring. As I scrubbed in for the surgery, I couldn't help but notice the skeptical looks from some of the other staff members. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. My mother's words echoed in my mind. "Don't you dare let them see you falter." The operation began, and I found myself working alongside Dr. Graves and several other senior staff members. The tension in the room was palpable, with the knowledge that important observers were watching their every move adding an extra layer of pressure. Despite the challenging circumstances, I remained focused, my movements precise and efficient. I anticipated the needs of the surgeons, handing them instruments before they even had to ask. My years of training and experience were shining through. However, as the operation progressed, I noticed something that made my heart race. Dr. Graves, usually so confident and sure, seemed to be hesitating. His hands trembled slightly as he prepared to make a critical incision. In that split second, I realized that Dr. Graves was about to make a potentially life-threatening mistake. Without hesitation, I spoke up. "Dr. Graves," I said, my voice clear and steady, "perhaps we should consider approaching from a different angle. The patient's anatomy suggests it might be safer." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to me. Dr. Graves looked at me, a mix of surprise and anger flashing across his face. For a moment, I thought he might dismiss my suggestion outright, but then, almost imperceptibly, Dr. Graves nodded. He adjusted his approach, following my suggestion. As they continued the operation, it became clear that my intervention had likely saved the patient's life. As the surgery concluded successfully, I could feel the weight of many eyes upon me. Some looked at me with newfound respect, while others, including Dr. Graves, seemed to be seething with barely contained anger. As they began to clean up, Dr. Graves turned to me, his voice low and menacing. "Nurse Parker, I need to see you in private immediately." I followed Dr. Graves out of the operating room, my heart pounding. I knew that speaking up had been the right thing to do, but I also knew that it might have just cost me my job. As they entered a private room, I was surprised to see that it was Mr. Edwards' room. In my focus on the operation, I had forgotten that he was still a patient in the hospital. Dr. Graves, however, seemed too angry to notice or care about their location. As soon as the door closed behind them, he rounded on me, his face red with fury. "How dare you question my judgment in there?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't have you fired on the spot for such insubordination." I stood my ground, my voice calm but firm. Dr. Graves, I was simply doing my job. The patient's safety, I replied. Your job, Dr. Graves interrupted, his voice rising. Your job is to follow orders, not to think you know better than your superiors. This is exactly why people like you don't belong in a prestigious institution like St. Mary's. You're here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because you have any real skill or knowledge. As Dr. Graves continued his tirade, becoming more openly racist and hostile with each passing moment, I felt a mix of anger and despair wash over me. Everything I had endured, every slight and microaggression, seemed to pale in comparison to this blatant display of prejudice. Just as I was about to respond, a voice cut through the room, stopping Dr. Graves mid-sentence. Dr. Graves, Mr. Edwards said, his voice filled with a quiet authority that neither of them had heard before. I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to. Both Dr. Graves and I turned, startled. To see Mr. Edwards sitting up in his bed, a look of controlled anger on his face. Mr. Edwards, Dr. Graves stammered, his face paling as he realized the gravity of his mistake. I didn't realize you were awake. I apologize for disturbing you. Oh, I'm very much awake, Dr. Graves, Mr. Edwards replied, his eyes narrowing, and I've been awake for quite some time. Long enough to observe the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have been treating Nurse Parker. I stood frozen, unable to believe what I was hearing. Mr. Edwards, the quiet, unassuming patient, was suddenly radiating an aura of power and authority that filled the room. Who are you? Dr. Graves asked, his earlier bravado completely evaporating. Mr. Edwards smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Someone who has the power to make or break this hospital's future. And right now, Dr. Graves, I'm not feeling very inclined to support an institution that allows such blatant racism and unprofessional behavior. As the gravity of the situation sank in, I felt a mix of emotions wash over me. Relief that someone had finally witnessed and acknowledged the treatment I had been enduring, anger at the injustice I had faced, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps finally things might change. Little did any of them know that this confrontation was about to set in motion a series of events that would shake St. Mary's to its very core, exposing long-hidden prejudices and forcing a reckoning that was long overdue.